Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, tensions were rising in Denmark as the Danes were growing increasingly tired of a political system where the king had absolute power and his subjects weren't even allowed to express critical views. When Christian VIII became king, the Danes hoped that things would change. After all, when he'd been king of Norway for a few months in 1814, he'd agreed to give the Norwegians the most liberal constitution in Europe. But by the time he acceded the Danish throne, he had changed his tune and opted for keeping the absolute system in place. King Christian didn't insist on clinging to power only because he liked to be in charge, though. Don't get me wrong, he did like to be in charge, but he also feared that a liberalization of the political system would bring about the collapse of his realm. He ruled over what was known as the unitary state, comprising the Kingdom of Denmark and the mostly German duchies Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg. Christian VIII worried that Danish and German nationalists, with their different and mutually incompatible ambitions, would end up breaking up the unitary state. But toward the end of his life, Christian realized he had to do something and initiated a process of careful, gradual change. He hoped he'd be around long enough to steer Denmark toward calmer political waters, making life easier for his son and heir, who Christian considered an incompetent moron who'd make a mess of things if he wasn't carefully managed. Today, we'll see what happened once Frederik VII actually became king. Episode 131, A Beloved Buffoon. First of all, I have a housekeeping item to take care of. More specifically, a correction to make. In the latest episode, I made a silly mistake. For some inexplicable reason, when talking about the introduction of absolutism in Denmark in 1660, I said the king who did it was Christian IV. That's obviously nonsense. It was his son, Frederik III, who did it. My apologies. I hope I didn't ruin too many Easter pub quizzes. Many thanks to Tim, Jürgen, and Eric, who all contacted me and pointed out my mistake. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get on with the show. As you may remember from last time, Christian VIII died unexpectedly in January 1848 from sepsis due to a bloodletting that had gone catastrophically wrong. The absolute power was left in the hands of his son, Frederik, now Frederik VII. From the dying Christian's perspective, this was a nightmare scenario he'd always feared. He'd wanted to guide Denmark for a few more years to ease his realm into a new political reality. Now his inexperienced and, let's be honest, incompetent son, Frederik was left with the task of abolishing the absolute power of the Danish crown. Still, Christian VIII had managed to prepare the ground somewhat. He and his conservative advisors and ministers had put together a draft constitution for the unitary state, that is, Denmark proper and the three duchies, Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg. Schleswig and Holstein had been governed by the king in Copenhagen in his capacity as Duke of Schleswig and of Holstein for about 400 years already, but Lauenburg was a relatively new addition. This micro-state was a consolation prize that the Danes had received when they were forced to hand over Norway to Sweden in 1814. The draft constitution was a far cry from what Christian VIII had accepted in Norway in 1814. It was a quite conservative document where the king agreed to give up as little as possible of his power and authority. Christian felt that baby steps were best in order not to endanger the cohesion of the unitary state. But now he was dead, and that meant the situation had changed drastically. Liberal Danish politicians saw an opportunity to draft a completely new constitution in a completely different, more radical spirit. One where the king had as little power as possible, and instead a parliament in Copenhagen would call the shots. Critically, they wanted that parliament to call the shots both in Denmark and in the Duchy of Schleswig, which had a mixed Danish and German population. The two remaining duchies, Holstein and Lauenburg, which were members of the German Confederation, would get a separate constitution. In fact, if they wanted to sever the ties to Denmark completely, most liberal politicians in Copenhagen wouldn't mind too much. The radical politicians who pushed for this agenda were twice lucky in the beginning of 1848. Not only did the old, experienced King Christian die, leaving the government in the hands of the daft Frederik, but at the same time, things were once again stirring on the continent. Already in January, unrest started far away in Palermo, leading to the Sicilian Revolution, but it was the events in Paris in February that really got the ball rolling. Later that month, rioting broke out in the French capital, and the unrest soon led to the collapse of the so-called July monarchy and the proclamation of the Second Republic. The news from France spread like wildfire across the continent and sparked local revolutions all over the place. The Netherlands, Austria, and the German Confederation were all gripped by revolutionary fervor, spreading panic at courts and in other leading circles. For example, when the leading conservative Austrian diplomat and politician Clemens von Metternich heard the news, he lost his cool and exclaimed, "Well, my dear, it's all over," but in French, because, I don't know, reasons. Anyway, rumors about what was happening in Paris first reached Kiel in the Duchy of Holstein on February 28th, by way of the brand new railway from Altona. The following day, the news reached the island of Zealand, arriving in Roskilde during the funeral of King Christian VIII, no less. Historians have named the dramatic months that followed the springtime of the peoples, on account of the fact that it was the most widespread revolutionary tidal wave to hit Europe so far in the history of revolutionary tidal waves. More than 50 countries and principalities of various sizes were swept up in the action. Revolutionaries, reformers, radicals and liberals demonstrated and demanded changes to the governing structures of the countries they lived in. They tended to demand roughly the same things: constitutions, representative parliaments, freedom of expression, an end to censorship, an expanded suffrage, and an armed national guard of some sort. Many of them had considerable success. As I already mentioned, in Paris the revolution led to the fall of the July monarchy under the Orleans king Louis Philippe. That was the fourth time the French had ousted a king since the fall of the Bastille. Unlike his distant cousin Louis XVI, though, Louis Philippe got to keep his head, and he went into exile in England. Another high-profile victim of the so-called springtime of the peoples was none other than the Pope, Pius IX, who had to escape Rome disguised as a regular priest. He hid out in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, while the Papal States were replaced by the Roman Republic. When the revolutionary wave crossed the Rhine River, demonstrations and riots broke out in German cities from Baden to Berlin and even Vienna, where Metternich was predicting his own downfall in French. Even though the revolution swept through all German lands, the revolutionaries themselves were far from united. Some were radicals who wanted a German republic, whereas the more moderate liberals wanted a constitutional monarchy of a united Germany. They met in Frankfurt am Main to write a constitution, and in the end the liberals were victorious. In March 1849, they'd finished writing a liberal constitution for their united German Empire, and they offered the crown of this empire to the King of Prussia, Frederik William IV. In the Habsburg Empire, the situation was even more delicate. There, the revolutionary fervor threatened to tear the empire apart when various peoples such as Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Serbs, Slovenes, Italians, Croats, Romanians, Ukrainians, Slovaks, and others were combining their demands for liberalization with cries for national self-determination. With impressive speed, Emperor Ferdinand I felt forced to declare himself a constitutional monarch. It was a fast but largely symbolic declaration, since there was no constitution for him to abide by yet. An assembly was quickly called to fill in this minor gap in the new system of government. So, big things were happening all over the place. The revolutions of 1848 swept away the French king, but in other places, the success of the revolutionaries was of a more temporary nature. And even though it typically took a few months for the forces of reaction to regroup and react, they eventually did. Sometimes this reaction entailed massacres and exiles of revolutionary politicians. The Pope soon had enough of radical reforms in his old domains and called for international help to quash the Republic and reinstate him as the sovereign in Rome. Perhaps unexpectedly, it was the newly formed French Republic that answered the Pope's call to restore him to his throne. French troops drove the Republican rebels from Rome in the summer of 1849 and stayed in the Eternal City to prop up the papal regime for another 20 years. The German Revolution also failed, not least because the Prussian king rejected the crown that had been offered by the Constitutional Assembly in Frankfurt. Frederik William was a firm believer in the divine right of monarchs, and he preferred to remain a king with absolute power instead of upgrading to an emperor whose power would be limited by a constitution. Or, as he himself put it, a crown like a dog collar, binding him to the revolution of 1848. Also in the Habsburg Empire, the forces of reaction eventually managed to wrest back control from the revolutionaries. Emperor Ferdinand abdicated in favor of his much more conservative nephew, Franz Joseph, who promptly put an end to the revolution. He adopted a conservative constitution and went on to rule his empire for more than half a century. But this isn't the Revolutions podcast, so I won't dwell anymore on the details of what went down in Paris, Rome, Frankfurt, Berlin, or Vienna. Instead, I suggest we return our focus to Denmark and examine the repercussions of the Revolution of 1848 in Copenhagen. Tradition dictates that when a monarch ascends the throne, he or she should take a motto. When Frederik VII became king in January 1848, he took the motto, "The love of the people, my strength." And even though his father and his advisors had serious doubts about Frederik's ability to reign, he was, in fact, loved by the people. Because, despite all his faults, Frederik was a jolly fellow, down-to-earth, charming, willing to engage with the lowest and the poorest of his subjects in the same way and with the same respect as he treated dukes and princes. It didn't hurt that the new king also enjoyed food, booze, and the company of beautiful women, all highly relatable interests among broad segments of the Danish population. But the fact that he was loved by regular people still didn't mean that Frederik was a good king. He most definitely was not. As I've already pointed out on several occasions, he was lazy, impatient, choleric, unpredictable, uneducated, probably dumb, and most definitely uninterested in governing. In other words, he had almost all the characteristics you don't want your leader to have at a time of crisis, and now here the crisis that his father and grandfather had feared more than anything else was at hand. So it was probably a good thing for Frederik that his dying father had jotted down those instructions that we finished the last episode talking about. Because after only a few days on the throne, Frederik VII did something historic. He called for the establishment of a completely new political body in the Danish context, a parliament of sorts. This assembly would be making political decisions, albeit with lots of conservative checks on their powers. Everyone loved this idea, and for a short while it looked like everything would be just fine. The succession would turn out to be smooth, and Denmark would enjoy a gradual and modest liberalization of its political system. But then all hell broke loose in France, kicking off the almost pan-European wave of revolutions. Liberal politicians in Denmark demanded a new government and a common constitution for Denmark and Schleswig, not just the watered-down compromise that Christian VIII had left for his successor. And in the duchies, German nationalist representatives demanded that Schleswig would be allowed to join Holstein as a part of the German Confederation. Things came to a head on March 20th, 1848, when the nationalist liberal leaders in Copenhagen met at the Casino Theatre. They discussed the situation, worked themselves up, and in the end they penned a message to the king, demanding a free constitution. They ended their missive with a thinly veiled threat, hoping the king would act and not force the nation to help itself out of desperation. Or, put bluntly, do as we say, or we will get rid of you. The following day, March 21st, a deputation of Copenhagen burghers went to see the king at Christiansborg Palace and presented him with this message. The tense situation was diffused immediately when King Frederik agreed to their demands without any sign of resistance. He let them know that the old conservative government, made up of his father's trusted men, was history, and that he'd appoint a new cabinet consisting of liberals in the next few days. So in the end, there was no need for a violent or bloody revolution to abolish absolutism in Denmark. But now, the promise of a constitutional monarchy had to be turned into practice by the writing of an actual constitution. So, once the decision was made, the work to write the constitution started. Just like in Norway, elections were held for a constitutional assembly. The right to vote was given to a surprisingly large number of Danes. Suffrage was extended to more people in Denmark in 1848 than had been the case in Norway 30 years before. Only women, convicted criminals, and the mentally ill were excluded. Once elected, the representatives of the Constitutional Assembly got together in Copenhagen and started their efforts to put together a new constitution for Denmark. The work continued through the fall of 1848, the following winter, and into the spring of 1849. As time went on, the early enthusiasm among the delegates of the assembly faded somewhat. You could even say that the mood soured. A rift between the peasants on the one hand and the burghers on the other became obvious. Even though they all wanted the king to have less power, that definitely didn't mean that they all had the same goals or aspirations for how the country should be governed. And it soon became evident that everyone wanted the new system of government to favor themselves and their way of life. More conservative and better off forces wanted to limit the suffrage enshrined in the new constitution to fewer groups than those who had elected the Constitutional Assembly. The line of reasoning was familiar in liberal thinking in 19th century Europe. Only those who owned property had real skin in the game, and only they should be allowed to influence how the state was governed. The peasantry objected, since they were the ones who would be excluded, but in the end they preferred to agree to robbing themselves of the right to vote in order not to have the whole project collapse, and no constitution at all be introduced. I have to say, I personally find that to be a display of impressive political maturity of a kind that should probably merit you the right to vote, but what do I know? At the end of the day, approximately 15% of the population would be eligible to vote. The excluded categories were known as the 7 Fs in Danish, but when translated into English, they're not quite as catchy, since only 2 of them begin with F in English as well. The excluded categories were women, farmhands, the poor, people who have gone bankrupt, the mentally ill, criminals, and foreigners. Anyway, much like in Norway, the issue of general conscription also became a point of conflict between the peasantry and the burghers. In the end, conscription was included in the constitution, but just like in Norway, it would take years for it to happen for real. Until 1867, it was still possible for Danes who didn't want to do their obligatory military service to pay someone else to serve in their place. On May 25th, 1849, the document was complete and a final vote was taken. It would be one of the most liberal constitutions in Europe at the time, despite the fact that the year of revolutions had passed and the usual suspects were once again re-establishing their grip over Europe. The document contained pretty much all the elements you'd expect to find in a liberal 19th century constitution, such as a division of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It also included all the classic bourgeois liberal rights: property rights, no censorship, freedom of religion, and freedom of political association. This new Danish constitution was adopted with a broad majority of 119 assemblymen voting in favor. But the vote wasn't unanimous. 4 assembly members actually voted against. A few days later, on June 5th, King Frederik VII sealed the deal by signing the constitution, thereby replacing the King's Law from 1665. Denmark had become a constitutional monarchy. To this day, June 5th is still celebrated in Denmark as Constitution Day. The news about the new constitution was greeted with great enthusiasm by the Danes. Their king was actually pretty happy as well. The new system of government removed a lot of the responsibilities from Frederik VII, and according to a popular story, he's supposed to have quipped, "Now I can sleep in as much as I want in the morning." It's probably not true, but it has the ring of truth, because the attitude describes Frederik VII to a T. He had no interest in governing, much preferring eating, drinking, and womanizing. In addition, he might not be smart enough to fully grasp the ramification of what he just agreed to. And even if he did understand, he couldn't care less. Now he was free to pursue his real interests. And one of these interests was a certain lady called Louise Rasmussen. Well, okay, maybe lady is a bit of a stretch. In fact, Louise was far from a lady, at least when Frederick met her and she became his mistress. She wasn't a princess. She wasn't even an aristocrat. She was a ballet dancer, born out of wedlock to a housemaid. But she was, apparently, very pretty. During his years as crown prince, courtiers and politicians had done what they could to discourage Frederick from spending time with Louise. They had tried to break them up, but to no avail. Apparently, the fact that Frederick had refused to break things off with Louise was a major factor behind his second divorce. When Frederik became king, she even moved into an apartment of her own at Christiansborg Palace so that she'd always be close at hand. In 1850, the year after he'd gotten rid of the annoying business of ruling the state, Frederik VII went ahead and married Louise Rasmussen. Even though he got a bishop to conduct the service, it had to be a morganatic marriage, due to the low birth of the bride. Still, the Danish aristocracy would much rather have seen him marry yet another of his cousins, or even some princess he wasn't related to. But this, in their eyes, was just too much. I don't think you can imagine how thoroughly shocking it was to his contemporaries that the King of Denmark married the illegitimate daughter of a servant. I struggle to think of an example that would shock people today to the same degree. Maybe if the king were to marry a stripper with an active OnlyFans account. It didn't help that King Frederik tried to improve his wife's social status by granting her a noble title, making her the Countess of Danner. Or that Louise seemed to have a good influence on the king. She was able to restrain her husband's worst excesses in terms of anger, drinking and violence. But no, the upper echelons of Danish society never warmed to her. They shunned her and gave her the cold shoulder whenever they suffered the indignity of being in the same room as her. But unlike the aristocrats, the politicians and other members of the elites, the Danish peasantry liked Louise. They saw her as one of them, one of the people, and whenever she was traveling with the king, she was greeted warmly by the crowds. The marriage also boosted the king's popularity, since the common people saw it as a proof that Frederik VII wasn't a snob. He was even happy to marry one of his lowliest subjects. Even though it can be awkward when your wife isn't accepted by your friends and family, the aversion towards Louise actually had an even more serious effect, one that had the potential of putting Denmark in danger. In a time when the status of the monarch was much more important than it is today, Frederik's decision to marry Louise actually harmed Denmark's international reputation. At foreign courts, the opinion of the union between the King of Denmark and the ballet dancer was pretty much the same as it was at home. Foreign princes and diplomats drew the conclusion that Frederik VII must be mad, clearly unreliable. That, in turn, made Denmark unreliable. That kind of thing could potentially have grave consequences if Denmark would be drawn into yet another conflict with one of the great powers, as it had been in the beginning of the 1800s. And at this very moment, Denmark was getting itself involved in such a conflict. And the new Countess Danner actually played a more active role in the whole thing than just distancing Denmark from its allies. As I've mentioned a few times already, Frederik's father, Christian VIII, had worried about the consequences of introducing a liberal system of government where the basis for the state no longer was the crown, but a constitution. This would weaken and even potentially break the connection between Denmark proper and the duchies, Schleswig, Holstein and Lauenburg. Keeping the unitary state intact had been one of the main missions of Christian VIII's reign. The conservative German-speaking aristocracy in the duchies had supported the crown in this effort, partly because they had sworn oaths to do so, and partly because they didn't trust their own liberal politicians at home, fearing that they would take away power from the nobility and give it to the people. But these German aristocrats were just as put off by Frederik's relationship with Louise Rasmussen as the Danish toffs were. So, when the king married her and made her a countess, this weakened the support for the crown in the duchies. To make matters worse, Louise supported the Danish patriotic agenda of incorporating Schleswig, with its mixed Danish-German population, into the Kingdom of Denmark. And she didn't hesitate to try and influence King Frederik to support this position as well. And Frederik, uninterested in politics but infatuated with Louise, went along with it. But she wasn't the only one to push the king in this dangerous direction. Also Karl Berling, a man Frederik had gotten to know when he'd been banished to Jutland in the 1830s, was an ardent believer in a greater Danish kingdom, including Schleswig. When Frederik became king, he took Berling with him and gave him an elevated position at court. The other courtiers looked down on Berling as a parvenu, but he became close with Louise. Together, they formed a liberal and nationalist opposition from within the royal court against the conservative powers among the courtiers and the royal family, who clung to the old goal of preserving the unitary state, and who thought that the liberals and their supporters surrounding the throne were playing with fire, with their new constitution and talk about moving the Danish border south to include the Duchy of Schleswig. After the adoption of the Danish constitution, the liberals and the nationalists, who were basically the same people, were now in control of political life in Copenhagen. One of the leading politicians was a guy called Orla Lehmann. He'd been fighting against absolutism for decades, and this was his time to shine. He was also a strong supporter of a greater Denmark, and back in 1842 he'd launched the so-called Eder program under the slogan, Denmark to the Eder. The Eder was, and still is, a river. In the 1800s, it formed the border between the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. The program basically called for Schleswig to be incorporated into the Kingdom of Denmark, and Holstein and Lauenburg to be disconnected from the Danish crown altogether. Instead, they should just form parts of the German Confederation. The last years of Christian VIII's reign, Lehmann had spent in Italy, nursing his disappointment over the endurance of absolutism. But when he heard about the king's death, he hurried home to try to influence Danish politics in a more liberal and nationalist direction. By pure coincidence, Lehmann returned home via Paris, which erupted in its 1848 revolution just as he was passing through. So he was sort of carried home to Copenhagen on that metaphorical wave of liberal revolutions. Orla Lehmann had been one of the leading men at the Casino Theatre meeting on March 20th that decided to send the new king that thinly veiled threat about introducing reform, or else. In fact, it was none other than Lehmann who'd penned that message to the king. But in the spring of 1848, threatening the monarch was evidently not a career-ending move, because Lehmann was actually included in the new liberal government that Frederik VII appointed a few days later, the so-called March Cabinet. Even though he didn't last very long in that government, Lehmann remained very much active in Danish politics, remaining one of the people pushing the country in a liberal and nationalist direction. Meanwhile, the king seemed happy with the situation, content to have handed over the time-consuming and tedious task of governing the state to these politicians, favored by his wife and friends. He seemed oblivious to the dangers of this course of action, thinking nothing could go wrong. Tune in next time to see if he was right. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. And on Instagram. I look forward to hearing from you.